Hey guys, welcome back to Sleepless Boring History, the place where we turn long-forgotten lives into vivid, living stories. Have you ever wondered what it was like to grow up as a girl in medieval Europe? Not in the castles and ballads, but in the quiet corners of real life on muddy village roads, in smoky kitchens, inside candlelit convents or fortress-like manors. Today we're diving into the real story of how girls were raised, shaped and prepared for a future that most of them didn't choose, but were expected to fulfill. From the moment of birth, a medieval girl's path was often already laid out. Childhood wasn't about discovery, it was about preparation. The society around her had one clear goal in mind: shape her into a wife, and eventually a mother. But how did that happen? What traditions did she grow up with? What skills was she taught? And what values were drilled into her? And most importantly, what did it feel like to live that life? Silently groomed by family, church and custom to fit into a role older than memory itself. Let's begin at the very start. Birth. In a world where infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, the arrival of a healthy baby boy or girl was a cause for relief, if not outright celebration. But social status mattered from day one. A peasant girl born into a farming family was often met with practicality, another pair of hands for housework and one day for tending crops or raising livestock. A noble-born girl, by contrast, might be greeted with guarded optimism, a potential tool for diplomacy, marriage alliances, or religious dedication. In both cases, however, her life was not her own. It belonged to the household, the family name, and often the ambitions of men. From infancy, girls were placed under strict societal expectations. Baptized shortly after birth, she was immediately woven into the Christian fabric of medieval life. Religion wasn't a side dish, it was the main course. Girls were raised on stories of the Virgin Mary, taught to pray, and taught early that virtue was their greatest asset. Obedience, humility, chastity, these weren't just moral guidelines, they were the currency of feminine worth. And education? That depended entirely on status. A noble girl might learn to read Latin prayers, play an instrument, or even dabble in French or Italian. But a peasant girl's education was found in firewood gathering, bread baking, or fetching water. It was practical, physical, and constant. By the age of 7 or 8, the grooming became more deliberate. A girl was no longer just a child, she was a young lady in the making. At home she learned to spin wool, keep accounts, sew garments, care for younger siblings, and emulate the speech and manner of her mother or governor. In noble homes, young girls were sometimes sent to other aristocratic households as ladies-in-waiting. There they'd observe older women, learn court etiquette, and begin absorbing the customs that would later define their roles as wives and mistresses of a state. This wasn't kindness, it was training. Every gesture, every curtsy, every lesson in silence or modesty, it all fed into a future where her worth would be judged, not by her dreams, but by her dowry, her manners, and her fertility. As she entered puberty, the expectations intensified. Around age 12 to 14, many girls, especially in noble circles, were already being matched for marriage. Betrothal wasn't always immediate marriage, but it was a legally binding agreement. A girl might still be playing with dolls one year, and preparing for her wedding the next. Imagine that her body still changing, her mind still young, and yet she's being sized up for motherhood, handed a dowry chest and spoken of in terms of lineage, bloodlines, and land inheritance. Romance? That was for troubadours and poets. Marriage was a contract. The wedding day itself, though wrapped in ritual and celebration, was more about transition than love. Dressed in carefully chosen colors, often red, gold or blue, a medieval bride was veiled, prayed over, and placed at the altar not as an equal, but as property changing hands. The church blessed the union, the guests feasted, and the bride's new role began: keeper of the household, bearer of children, and servant to her husband's name. Her dowry now absorbed into his family, her loyalties rerouted into his bloodline. She entered a new home with few rights and great expectations. But not all medieval girls followed the same script. In rural areas, marriage might come later. Economic necessity could delay unions until a girl was strong enough to survive childbirth or run a home. Some girls entered convents, escaping the path of wifehood altogether, dedicating themselves to prayer, education, or silent seclusion. And of course, widows, especially wealthy ones, could sometimes wield more freedom than they ever had as wives. Yet, these were exceptions, not the rule. So why does this matter? because history often forgets the girl. We know the kings, the knights, the crusades, but beneath the surface were lives just as complex, just as shaped by duty, fear, and resilience. A girl in medieval Europe didn't just grow up, she was sculpted, piece by piece, into someone the world needed her to be. Her childhood wasn't about becoming herself, it was about becoming useful. And while her story may be quiet in the pages of history, today we're bringing it back into the light. So stay with me, because in the chapters ahead, we'll follow her journey in full, from the innocence of childhood to the heavy veil of wifehood, unpacking the rituals, routines, and silent expectations that shaped her world. This isn't just about history, it's about understanding the systems that built our past, and the human cost behind every noble marriage, every perfect feast, and every stained glass saint. This is a girl's life in medieval Europe, and you're watching Sleepless Boring History. Let's begin. What was it like to be a girl in medieval Europe? From the cradle to the wedding altar, her path was charted long before she could speak. In a world governed by religion, rigid class divisions, and deeply patriarchal expectations, her fate was not merely influenced, it was predetermined. A girl was not born into a world of opportunity or personal ambition, but into a tightly regulated structure that dictated her duties, her education, her worth, and eventually her destiny as a wife and mother. Today we explore this journey in full, the upbringing, the values, the skills, and the expectations that transformed a child into a vessel for family legacy, religious obedience, and marital allegiance. Her life was one of constant instruction, silent sacrifices, and learned submission. Whether she was born to nobility or poverty, the forces that shaped her were vast, intimate, and relentless. Medieval Europe, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was a continent defined by disorder and control all at once. The fall of the Western Roman Empire created a vacuum that was filled by feudal structures, religious authority, and a growing dependence on land-based wealth and status. This world was not monolithic, it was diverse in culture and regional practice, but one common thread that bound most European societies together was a deeply ingrained sense of hierarchy between men and women, nobles and peasants, clergy and laity. Girls from birth occupied one of the lowest rungs in this social ladder, with very few paths available to rise beyond what was assigned. Whether born in the forests of France, the towns of England, the castles of the Germanic states, or the villages of Spain, a girl's place in the world was shaped by who her father was, what land he held, and what faith he followed. The early years of a girl's life were defined by silence and survival. Infant mortality was common, and childbirth itself was a dangerous event for both mother and child. A girl who survived her first years was immediately folded into domestic routine. She was baptized early, sometimes within days of birth, initiating her into Christian society and giving her a religious identity before she could form one for herself. Naming was important, often reflecting a saint or maternal ancestor, reinforcing family continuity and religious ideal. From that moment on, her life was not her own. It belonged to God, to her parents, and ultimately to the husband who would claim her. The expectations started young. She was to be quiet, modest, obedient, and helpful. From her first steps she was guided away from independence and into utility. In both noble and peasant households, the roles and behaviors expected of girls were constantly reinforced. In poorer homes, she assisted in everything: watching siblings, carrying firewood, washing garments, tending animals, and helping in food preparation. This wasn't just labor, it was education. She learned by doing, through observation and repetition, absorbing every gesture and instruction from the women around her. Her education wasn't formal, it was practical and grounded in survival. Her mind and hands were trained to serve a household. In wealthier homes the goals were different, but the grooming was just as intense. Noble girls might be taught to read and write in Latin or French, learn musical instruments, embroidery and religious texts, and perfect the arts of politeness and reserve. These weren't just accomplishments, they were carefully selected attributes meant to make her marriageable, desirable, and socially appropriate. The Christian Church played an outsized role in this process. It wasn't merely a source of spiritual instruction, it was the lens through which womanhood was defined. The model for every girl was the Virgin Mary, silent, faithful, self-sacrificing, and pure. Saints were held up as examples not for their accomplishments, but for their piety, chastity, and suffering. The Church taught that women were morally weaker than men, and therefore needed more regulation, more guidance, and more spiritual discipline. Girls were taught to confess early, to fear sin, to accept suffering, and to strive for holiness through obedience. These ideas were woven into every part of life, in bedtime prayers, in church sermons, in stories told by elders, and in the rules of the household. This spiritual molding reinforced the belief that a girl's virtue was her most valuable possession, and one that once lost could never be regained. By the time a girl reached the age of 7 or 8, she was considered morally accountable and socially aware. She was no longer treated as an infant, but as a future woman. This meant more responsibility, more instruction, and often, more surveillance. Her clothing changed to reflect modesty, and her behavior was corrected if it seemed too wild, curious, or proud. Her relationships with boys were discouraged, or monitored. She was taught to lower her gaze, to wait her turn, to keep her voice soft. Every small moment became a lesson in restraint. In noble homes, girls might be sent to serve in another family's household as a lady-in-waiting, where they were exposed to courtly manners, noble customs, and the subtleties of power and deference. Here they learned not only how to behave, but how to be seen, gracefully, respectfully, and only when appropriate. For girls of all classes, puberty brought a fundamental shift. It was the beginning of womanhood, not marked by independence or exploration, but by increased regulation. Her body was now subject to scrutiny and protection. The onset of menstruation signaled fertility, and therefore eligibility for marriage. In many cases, a girl as young as 12 could be betrothed or even wed, though consummation might be delayed. Marriage was never just a personal choice. It was a family strategy, a legal contract, a spiritual duty. Girls were traded, gifted, negotiated, and positioned as means to secure alliances, consolidate wealth, or transfer land. A noble girl might be matched with a powerful lord to strengthen political ties, while a peasant girl might marry a neighbor to keep labor close and avoid splitting land. In all cases, her voice mattered less than the signatures of the men arranging the deal. The preparations for marriage were meticulous. In noble homes, this included assembling a dowry, planning the wedding ceremony, securing blessings from the church, and grooming the bride for her new life. She might receive instruction on household management, religious leadership within the home, and marital submission. Her virginity was a public matter, discussed, guarded, and eventually symbolized in ritual and dress. White or blue garments, veils, and religious tokens marked her purity. In rural areas, the traditions were simpler but equally symbolic: tokens of land, feasting, blessings from neighbors, and public ceremonies at the church. The wedding day itself was often joyful on the surface, but represented an enormous psychological shift. A girl left her family home and entered a husband's household, where she would likely have little authority, few allies, and no escape. The moment a girl became a wife was the moment her childhood officially ended. Marriage in medieval Europe was not a partnership of equals. The church taught that the husband was the head of the wife, as Christ was head of the church. Her role was to obey, to bear children, and to keep the home. Her thoughts, opinions, and feelings were often irrelevant to the functioning of the household. In noble homes, she might manage servants and supervise estates in her husband's absence, but even this was within strict boundaries. In peasant homes, her work never ended: cooking, farming, weaving, bearing and raising children, and contributing to every aspect of domestic survival. Illness, hunger, and childbirth were constant threats, and many women died young, yet the expectation remained: serve, endure, reproduce, repeat. And yet medieval girls were not blank slates or passive vessels. Within this system, many found small freedoms, moments of laughter, friendship, curiosity, and learning. Some formed strong bonds with other women in their family or community. Some found strength in faith, beauty in tradition, or purpose in motherhood. Some ran away to join convents, where education, spiritual authority, and independence were sometimes more accessible than in the outside world. Others became widows and used their legal status to manage property or refuse remarriage. While most were shaped by external forces, many girls carried inner lives of resilience, resistance, and quiet courage. The history of these girls is not always found in grand documents or heroic tales. It lives in church records, marriage contracts, household manuals, and the rare letters or diaries that survived. It lives in the architecture of convents, in stained glass windows that honor female saints, and in the forgotten grave markers of young brides lost to child. Their stories challenge our ideas of agency, childhood, and identity. They ask us to look beyond modern definitions of freedom and success, and instead ask, how did these girls survive? How did they navigate a world that was not designed for their voice? Understanding the life of a girl in medieval Europe is about more than history. It's about empathy. It's about recognizing that behind every anonymous name in a record book was a person who laughed, cried, hoped, and someone who, like girls today, sought love, security, connection and meaning. Someone whose life was shaped by decisions she didn't make but whose story is worth remembering. In this series we will explore each stage of this journey, beginning with early childhood, where expectations were planted, then through the adolescent years where grooming became intention, and finally into the complexities of marriage, childbirth, and adult womanhood in a deeply stratified world. This is not a story of fairy tales or legend. This is the real life of real girls whose voices have too long been lost to silence. You're watching Sleepless, Boring History, and this is the beginning of a girl's life in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, childhood was not seen as a separate, protected phase of life, but rather a brief transition between birth and the assumption of social responsibilities. For girls, early childhood was more than a stage of innocence. It was the beginning of grooming for a life predetermined by class, gender, and religion. A girl's early years laid the groundwork for the expectations she would carry into adolescence, and eventually into marriage. These formative years, often overshadowed by the adult roles that followed, deserve close attention, because it was in childhood that the ideologies of obedience, modesty, and duty were first instilled. Life expectancy in medieval Europe was low by modern standards, and infant mortality rates were high. The birth of a healthy child, especially in poorer households, was both a moment of joy and one of immediate anxiety. The death of a newborn or the mother was tragically common. A girl who survived her first year was already seen as fortunate, but that fortune did not translate into freedom. She was born into a rigid structure that would quickly begin to shape her into the person society expected her to be. The church had immense influence over the first rituals of a girl's life. Baptism usually took place within days of birth. This act was not only a religious rite but a cultural one, introducing the child into the Christian community, and symbolically into the network of expectations that came with it. Godparents were chosen, often from extended family or trusted neighbors, and they pledged to guide the child's spiritual and moral development. Naming was also significant. Girls were commonly named after saints or family members, names that often reflected ideals of purity, faith, and obedience. Names like Mary, Agnes, Claire, and Catherine were favored for their association with spiritual virtue. From infancy, a girl was treated differently from her brothers. Even before she could speak or walk, the adults around her projected onto her a set of behavioral expectations, rooted in centuries of patriarchal thinking. Girls were expected to be quiet, passive, gentle, and compliant. If a young girl showed signs of curiosity or assertiveness, these traits were often discouraged or redirected. A girl was praised not for strength or boldness, but for silence, stillness, and service. The physical spaces a girl occupied in her early childhood were typically domestic and closely supervised. In peasant households, this meant she was surrounded by activity: cooking, cleaning, fetching water, tending to animals, and helping older siblings. From her earliest years, she witnessed labor as a daily reality. Girls often sat beside their mothers, learning how to knead dough, sew garments, spin wool, and tend fires. They were expected to assist in these tasks almost as soon as they could walk. Childhood was not a protected sphere but an apprenticeship in gendered labor. In noble households, girls experienced a different kind of early childhood, less physical labor, but far greater scrutiny and ceremonial shaping. Noble daughters were often raised by nursemaids and governesses rather than their mothers. These women were responsible for instilling discipline, grace, and manners from a very young age. Girls learned how to sit, how to speak softly, how to walk without stumbling, and how to express humility. They were discouraged from asking too many questions or drawing attention to themselves. Their emotional expression was tightly regulated. Even laughter could be seen as undignified if too loud or frequent. Play in early childhood was permitted, but even here the activities reinforced gender roles. Peasant girls might play with handmade dolls, pretend to cook with clay pots, or imitate their mother's household chores. In wealthier homes, girls were given miniature looms, toy cradles, and illustrated religious texts. These toys were not just distractions, they were tools of socialization. Even in play, girls practiced being caretakers, housekeepers, and eventually mothers. The games of girls taught them their future was domestic, private, and oriented around the needs of others. Formal education for girls in early childhood was rare and heavily class-dependent. Peasant girls received no formal instruction in literacy or arithmetic. Instead, Their education came entirely from observing the adults around them and participating in chores, songs, prayers, and oral storytelling were their curriculum. They learned not only how to keep a household but how to speak appropriately, how to act modestly, and how to internalize fear of sin and pride. Noble girls were more likely to receive some education, especially in religious households or court. Tutors or clerics might teach them to read the Psalms, understand Latin prayers, and recite memorized passages, but even this learning was designed not to empower, but to reinforce submission and piety. By the age of 5 or 6, girls were expected to sit still during church services, to participate in family prayers, and to memorize moral lessons. This spiritual instruction was constant and unrelenting. The concept of original sin loomed large in Christian doctrine, and girls were reminded early and often that their souls were fragile and easily corrupted. Obedience to parents, confession of small wrongs, and the daily regulation of emotion and behavior became key elements of their moral development. In this period, distinctions between girls and boys became more pronounced. Boys were allowed, even encouraged, to explore, roughhouse and take risks. Girls were not. Boys learned to assert, girls learned to submit. These differences were not only observed, they were enforced. A girl who resisted authority might be punished, isolated, or shamed. In some households, physical discipline was applied liberally. The rod, the switch, and the strap were all common tools for maintaining discipline and driving home lessons of obedience. The religious calendar also shaped the lives of young girls. Festivals, saints' days and holy seasons like Lent or Advent provided structure to the year. For girls, these were often moments of ritualized restriction, fasting, confession, quiet reflection. They might be expected to wear simpler clothing, avoid indulgences, and spend time in prayer. These religious observances reinforced the notion that discipline and self-denial were signs of virtue. Even young children were drawn into the cycles of guilt, repentance and redemption that governed medieval Christian life. Interactions with older women formed the heart of a girl's early childhood. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts and female neighbors all contributed to her understanding of what it meant to be a woman. They told stories, some instructional, others cautionary, about girls who obeyed and prospered, or disobeyed and suffered. They shared folk wisdom about childbirth, housework and courtship. They enforced modesty in dress and behavior. And in quieter moments, they sometimes passed down their own hopes, fears and regrets. These interactions created a web of feminine socialization that both supported and restricted the girl growing within it. One of the defining experiences of early childhood was the growing awareness of surveillance. Girls were taught from a young age that their behavior was being watched by parents, neighbors, clergy and even God. Modesty in dress, softness in speech and deference to authority were not just expected, they were monitored. A girl who behaved improperly brought shame not only on herself but on her entire family. This constant surveillance produced anxiety, self-monitoring, and in many cases the suppression of self-expression. At the same time, early childhood was not entirely joyless. Girls found ways to play, to connect, to explore within the boundaries they were given. They developed friendships with siblings and neighbors, sang songs, made up games, and laughed at small things. In villages, they might chase chickens, collect flowers, or make wreaths. In noble households they might play string games, dance or These moments of levity were not trivial, they were acts of imagination and resilience. But even these moments were fleeting, and as the girl grew, the walls of expectation closed in tighter. By age 7 or 8, the girl was no longer seen as a child. In many households this was the age when she began full-time participation in adult work. In noble homes, she might be sent to another family's estate for education and service. In peasant homes, she took on the duties of a young adult. Her dress would change, simpler but more modest. Her freedom would shrink, her exposure to male spaces would be reduced, and she would begin to hear more often the word marriage, not as a fantasy, but as an approaching reality. These early years, though rarely documented in detail, were foundational. It was in early childhood that a girl learned her worth was conditional on her obedience, her chastity, her usefulness. She learned to listen before speaking, to watch before acting, and to yield rather than challenge. Her days were full not of choices, but of instruction. Yet within this structure, she still developed a sense of self, a fragile, impressionable self, molded by the hands of mothers, priests, customs and silence. Early childhood in medieval Europe was for girls both a beginning and a boundary. It opened a door into a life of service, endurance, and expectation, but closed off other paths before they could even be imagined. To understand the full life of a medieval woman, we must begin here in the quiet corners of the hearth, in the whispered warnings of older women, in the steady hands that placed a veil on her head before she even knew why. This was the first chapter in a life scripted long before it was lit. And yet even within this script, each girl brought something uniquely her own, a spark, a voice, a moment of resistance or grace. These are the stories that history often overlooks, but not here. Chapter 3: Puberty and Marriage Preparations. In medieval Europe, the line between childhood and adulthood for girls was neither gradual nor flexible. It was sharply drawn, and that line was puberty. When a girl's body began to change, society took notice. The expectations placed upon her intensified, and her life entered a new phase, one shaped not by self-discovery, but by preparation for marriage. Puberty was not seen as a private transformation, but as a signal to family, church, and community that a girl was approaching her most valuable stage, fertility. From that moment, her childhood was effectively over, and everything she did was judged by how well she fulfilled the role awaiting her. As soon as physical signs of puberty appeared, typically between the ages of 12 and 14, a girl was seen less as a child, and more as a future wife and mother. The onset of menstruation marked a profound social and spiritual threshold. For the church, it was proof of a girl's readiness to bear children, and thus to marry. For her family, it was an indicator that negotiations for marriage could begin in earnest, or if already arranged, that marriage could be finalized and consummated. For the girl herself, it was often a time of fear, confusion, and increased pressure, both emotional and practical. Few girls understood what was happening to their bodies. Menstruation was rarely explained in advance, and when it arrived, it could be treated as shameful or even frightening. In some communities, there were folk rituals designed to protect a girl during her first cycle. In others, the event was hidden or ignored entirely. Cleanliness became a moral expectation, and discussions around hygiene were often tied to spiritual purity. Some households required a girl to confess her feelings or dreams, fearing that puberty brought with it not only physical temptation but also spiritual vulnerability. All of this was deeply gendered. Boys were celebrated for coming of age, girls were cautioned, hidden, or quietly observed. With the body maturing, the family's attention turned to marriage. In medieval Europe, marriage was not a romantic pursuit, but a social contract, a business deal, and a spiritual obligation. Girls from noble or merchant families were rarely allowed any say in the matter. Even among peasants, where arrangements were less formal, pressure to marry well and early was strong. In many cases, girls were promised in marriage by age 7, even though the wedding itself might not occur until adolescence. Once puberty arrived, the betrothal could be converted into a legal marriage. The church recognized marriages from the age of 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Although not all unions were consummated immediately, this legal framework permitted and in some cases encouraged very early marriage. Marriage negotiations were complex. They involved the exchange of property, land, and influence. The dowry system played a central role. A girl's family was expected to provide goods or money to the husband's household. This could be livestock, furniture, land, or coin. The size and quality of the dowry reflected the girl's value in the eyes of the community, and directly affected her marital options. A generous dowry might secure a more favorable match. A small one might limit her to less desirable prospects. In some cases, girls without dowries were sent to convents, not because of spiritual calling, but due to lack of resources. The betrothal ceremony was often formal. In noble families, it might involve a written contract, witnessed and sealed, and a symbolic gift, often a ring or token. In rural areas, a handshake and the exchange of wine or bread between families might suffice. But even among the poor, the betrothal was not taken lightly. Breaking an engagement could lead to legal disputes, social disgrace, or violence. From the moment a girl was promised, she was spoken of as a future wife, and any behavior that could compromise her reputation was harshly discouraged. With betrothal often came education in marital duties. This varied by class. A peasant girl might receive advice on cooking for two, keeping chickens, and raising children. A noble girl might be instructed in the running of a manor, the art of hospitality, and the responsibility of estate management in her husband's absence. In both cases, she was reminded that her new home would require her to serve, support, and submit. While boys might receive a last chance to sow their oats before settling down, girls were expected to be pure in body and mind. Virginity was not merely a personal virtue, it was legal evidence, spiritual capital, and family pride. The idea of consent was complicated. The church technically required that both bride and groom consent freely to marriage, but in reality, this was often a formality. Girls were raised to saying no was considered disobedience, rebellion, or even heresy. In cases where a girl refused, she could be locked away, disinherited, or placed in a convent. There were legal protections on paper, but little enforcement. A girl's consent was usually assumed, and silence was interpreted as agreement. Preparing for the wedding involved more than ceremony. It involved physical and psychological transition. A girl's clothing would change, sometimes symbolically shifting from childhood colors to adult hues. She might be given new jewelry, a belt, or a veil. In noble households, she might be confined to the company of female relatives to protect her reputation before the wedding. Advice came from all sides, from mothers, aunts, older sisters, even village-wise women. Some of it was helpful: how to manage a household, how to cook a feast, but much of it was preparation for submission. She was told to obey her husband, to bear children without complaint, to manage servants with fairness, but firmness, and to expect little affection. The wedding itself was often public, ceremonial and legally binding. The church played a central role, blessing the union before God and the community. For peasants, this might take place in the local chapel with a feast in the village hall. For nobility, the wedding could span days, complete with elaborate clothes, symbolic rituals, and the presence of political allies. Some customs included breaking bread over the couple's heads for fertility, throwing coins to children for good fortune, or parading the bride through the village as a symbol of transition. In certain regions, there was even a ritual known as the bedding ceremony, where guests escorted the newlyweds to their bedchamber, a practice that ranged from symbolic to invasive. For the girl, the wedding was both celebration and surrender. She was handed over, literally and legally, to her husband. Her name might change, her home would change, her role would solidify. The very structure of medieval marriage laws placed her under her husband's authority. She could not own property independent. Her rights to her own body were minimal. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime. In many areas, a girl went from her father's legal possession to her husband's, with no intermediary space of personal autonomy. The psychological toll of this transition is difficult to quantify, but it was likely immense. Many girls entered marriage with little understanding of sex, of childbirth, or of their own anatomy. While some families attempted to prepare daughters gently, others let them learn through experience. The results were often traumatic. First-time brides could be as young as 12 or 13. Many died in childbirth within their first years of marriage. Even those who survived faced repeated pregnancies, domestic responsibility, and the constant fear of widowhood, or love, as we imagine it, was not a guarantee. Some marriages grew into companionships. Others remained cold, controlling, or violent. But for most girls, love was a luxury they were never told to expect. In noble circles, the political stakes were even high. Girls might be married off to older men, sometimes decades their senior, for diplomatic advantage. These girls became pawns in broader struggles between kingdoms, houses, and territory. Their success was measured, not in personal fulfillment, but in the production of heirs, the management of estates, and the advancement of family interests. Even queens were not immune. Their marriages were public performances, their pregnancies national concerns, their miscarriages political disasters. Among peasants, the dynamic was often more practical. Girls married local boys, usually chosen by their families for their reliability, work ethic, or small parcels of land. Here, marriage was about survival. A girl needed protection, economic stability, and help raising children. She might work beside her husband in the fields, raise livestock, or sell goods at market. Her world remained small, but her responsibilities were vast. Across regions, variations existed. In southern Europe, marriages tended to be more patriarchal, with stricter controls over women's movement and behavior. In northern Europe, especially in urban centers, women occasionally participated in family businesses or managed inns and taverns. In some areas, local customs allowed girls to choose their husbands, though always within limits. But these exceptions did not undo the general rule. Marriage was the culmination of a long process of socialization, one that began in infancy and was finalized through contract, ceremony, and consummation. What is perhaps most remarkable about this stage is how completely it defined a girl's identity. Marriage was not just a personal event, it was the organizing principle of her life. It determined her worth, her safety, her standing, and her future. Girls who failed to marry by choice, misfortune, or poverty were often viewed with suspicion. They were pitied, feared, or marginalized. The term spinster had moral weight. A girl without a husband was often assumed to be strange, cursed, or worse, unvirtuous. And yet, not all marriages were prisons. Some women found meaning in their roles. They developed friendships, managed resources, raised children, and wielded quiet influence over their households. Others escaped oppressive homes through widowhood, inheritance, or religious retreat. In convents, women could read, write, lead, and even resist, but these routes were limited, and for most girls, marriage was not a question, it was an inevitability. Understanding this phase of a girl's life reveals just how structured and restrained medieval society could be. The transition from child to wife was not just a change in status, it was a transformation in being. Girls did not grow into women, they were made into wives. Their bodies were monitored, their minds conditioned, their relationships controlled. And yet, even within this narrow path, they carried with them voices, fears, hopes, and resilience. Chapter 4: The Wedding and After. The wedding day was not just a celebration, it was a public and spiritual contract, a transition from one stage of life to another. For a girl in medieval Europe, her wedding marked the moment she was no longer simply her father's daughter, but now a wife under the authority of her husband. It was a ceremony heavy with symbolism, legality, and expectation. It was the culmination of years of grooming and preparation, the fulfillment of a role assigned from birth, but it was also the beginning of something harder to define, a life of submission, labor, and often silence within a structure that rarely made room for her voice. In most communities, weddings were more than personal milestones, they were communal events. The entire village or town might be involved, and for noble families, the ceremony could attract guests from far and wide. Marriage was not just about two people, it was about two families, sometimes two estates, and occasionally, two political interests. This is why weddings were public by design. They needed witnesses, they needed formality, they needed the approval of the church, the consent of the families, and the presence of the community to make the union legitimate and binding. The church played a central role in defining marriage in the Middle Ages. By the 12th century, marriage was recognized as a sacrament, one of the 7 sacred rites of Christian life. The church insisted on mutual consent, but in practice this often meant a girl giving quiet approval after being told whom she would marry. The ceremony typically took place at the doors of the church, symbolizing the threshold between two phases of life. The priest would ask both bride and groom if they consented to the union, pronounce blessings, and lead them inside for a marriage. Rings were exchanged in some regions, while in others, tokens like coins or documents were used to signify the agreement. In peasant communities, the wedding might be simpler, but it still followed recognizable patterns. The bride and groom would process to the church, often accompanied by musicians, neighbors, or relatives. The bride might wear a crown of flowers, a sign of purity, and a cloak lent by her family. There might be dancing in the village square, food prepared communally, and homemade gifts offered in celebration. The ceremony was shorter but no less binding. Once the vows were made before witnesses, the couple was considered husband and wife under both divine and earthly law. For noble families, weddings were strategic affairs. The ceremony was elaborate and often timed to align with political seasons or feast days. Tapestries were hung in great halls, guests arrived on horseback with gifts, and the bride wore luxurious fabrics, often imported silk, linen, or fine wool dyed in red, blue, or gold. Jewelry might be exchanged, contracts signed, and dowries delivered. These events were not private. They were declarations of power and alliances. Sometimes the bride and groom had only just met. Sometimes they had known each other as children, having been promised in marriage for years, but the emotional bond, if any existed, came later, if it came at all. The symbols used during the wedding varied by region. In some areas, bread was broken over the bride's head to bring fertility. In others, a ceremonial sword was passed between families. In Italy, the bride might carry a pouch of coins. In England, the groom might place a ring on the bride's right hand during the ceremony, moving it to her left later. Music played, bells rang, and feasting began. But beneath all the pageantry, the purpose remained the same: to sanctify the transfer of a girl from one household to another, from one name to another, from childhood to wifehood. The wedding night, while less publicly observed, was still part of this transition. In some traditions, the couple was escorted to the bedchamber by family or friends, a practice known as the bedding ceremony. In the most formal settings, a priest or witnesses might bless the bed. In others, guests simply cheered as the door was shut behind the couple. What happened next was rarely documented, but expectations were clear. The marriage was not complete until it was consummated. For noble families, Evidence of the bride's virginity, blood on linens, or the absence of protest was sometimes required the next day. Failing to meet these expectations could cast doubt on the union, threaten alliances, or stain a family's reputation. For the bride, this night could be bewildering, frightening, or even traumatic. Many girls had received little to no education about sex. They were told to be obedient, to submit, and to fulfill their duty. Love was rarely discussed. Consent, as we define it today, was largely absent from the conversation. While some brides were treated kindly by their new husbands, others were not. The power dynamics were unbalanced, and the law offered little protection. A wife was expected to be sexually available to her husband at all times. Refusal was grounds for punishment. In many areas, marital rape was not recognized as a crime until centuries later. The day after the wedding, life resumed, but for the girl, everything had changed. She was now a wife expected to run a household, bear children, and serve her husband. Her status rose in some ways. She was no longer a child, and in some cases, she gained responsibilities and influence. But she also lost certain freedoms. Her movements were more restricted. Her contact with her birth family might decrease. Her tasks multiplied, especially if she married into a working class or agricultural household. In noble homes, she might oversee staff, supervise kitchens, or manage estate records. But in all cases, her role was clear. She was no longer living for herself. Pregnancy often followed quickly. Fertility was both a duty and a woman who failed to conceive was considered cursed or defective. Those who bore many children were praised, even if the toll on their bodies was severe. The dangers of childbirth were enormous. Many women died in labor or from complications shortly after. Still, they were expected to carry on. Childbirth was seen not just as biological, but as spiritual labor. Some women offered prayers to saints or wore charms for protection, but there were no guarantees. Death in childbirth was one of the most common causes of mortality for women of childbearing age. Domestic life varied depending on class. Peasant wives worked alongside their husbands in the fields, managed livestock, cooked, cleaned, raised children, and participated in local markets. Their labor was essential, and they were often respected within their communities for their endurance and skill. In towns, wives of merchants or artisans might assist in workshops, manage inventories, or sell goods. Noble women had a different kind of domestic life, one filled with ceremony, diplomacy, and the delegation of tasks. They entertained guests, maintained appearances, oversaw servants, and in their husband's absence, sometimes governed entire estates. But even these women lived under patriarchal authority. Their power was borrowed, not owned. Despite the constraints, many women developed routines, relationships, and identities within marriage. Some grew to care deeply for their husband. Others found strength in motherhood, in religious devotion, or in their local networks of women. Friendships with neighbors, sisters-in-law, or servants offered small moments of solidarity and joy. Religious observance provided structure and a sense of purpose. Women created altars in their homes, lit candles for departed relatives, fasted during holy days, and went on pilgrimage when possible. These acts, while spiritual, also reinforced community and personal dignity. Conflict was common. Disputes over money, infidelity, infertility, or work divided many households. Divorce, as we know it today, was not available. The church allowed separation in rare cases, such as abandonment or proven cruelty, but even then remarriage was forbidden. Widows had more freedom, especially if they inherited land or wealth. Some refused to remarry, and ran households on their own. Others became nuns, reclaiming religious control over their lives. But while widowhood could empower a woman, it came with new burdens: financial insecurity, vulnerability to predators, and the weight of raising children alone. Marriage also transformed a woman's legal identity. In many regions, she became a femme covert, literally, a covered woman. Her husband was her legal representative. She could not sue or be sued independently. She could not sign contracts or inherit property without special permission. In some towns, local laws allowed more autonomy, especially for widows or businesswomen. But in general, a married woman's legal existence was folded into her husband's. Her body, her labor, her children, all belonged to the marriage unit, not to her. And yet within these constraints, some women shaped meaningful lives. They wrote letters, composed prayers, embroidered artwork, told stories, and preserved family histories. They taught their children, negotiated trades, tended gardens, and passed down knowledge. They laughed, loved, mourned, and endured. Their lives were not footnotes to their husband. They were complex, dynamic, and essential to the survival and function of medieval society. For the girl who had now become a wife, her life was no longer defined by potential, it was defined by expectation. The future would bring challenges, childbirth, illness, loss, and possibly widowhood. But the wedding had closed one chapter and opened another one, where her role was fixed, her duties known, and her silence often assumed. Still, beneath the layers of tradition and obedience, she carried her own private world. Her thoughts, her memories, her quiet victories, these formed the core of her being. History may not always record them, but they were real, and in remembering her journey from girl to bride to wife, we begin to honor the lives lived not in grandeur, but in quiet strength. Chapter 5: Regional and Class Variations. Not all girls in medieval Europe lived the same life. While the ideals of obedience, chastity, and domesticity cut across cultures and classes, the actual experience of girlhood and wifehood was far from uniform. Geography mattered, class mattered, religion, politics, urbanization, and even language shaped the expectations and options available to girls growing up in the medieval world. In this final chapter, we examine those differences, not to erase the shared burdens of medieval womanhood, but to reveal the diversity of conditions that shaped each girl's life, from noble castles in France, to merchant homes in Italy and farming villages in England. A girl's fate could be radically different, depending on where and to whom she was born. Let's begin with class, the single greatest factor in determining a girl's life trajectory. For noble girls, life was defined by lineage and legacy. They were born into families who owned land, commanded loyalty, and often played roles in local or regional politics. Their education, while restricted by gender norms, was often broader than that of lower-class girls. They were taught courtly manners, languages, music, dance, and the skills required to manage estates. However, this privilege came at a cost. Noble girls were political tools, their marriages were arranged for power, and their lives closely managed by family elders and advisors. From childhood, their behavior was scrutinized. They were trained to represent not only themselves, but their entire family line. Their worth was often tied to how well they could secure or preserve alliances through marriage. In contrast, merchant-class girls had a very different upbringing. These girls were raised in households that blended commerce with domesticity. Their education was often practical, focused on bookkeeping, trade language, negotiation, and correspondence. In cities like Venice, Ghent, and Lübeck, daughters sometimes worked alongside their fathers in family businesses, particularly in textiles or food markets. A merchant's daughter might also help manage inventory, prepare ledgers, and write orders. While still expected to marry, some merchant girls were better prepared for economic life than their noble counterparts. In a few regions, they could inherit a portion of the family trade or business. Their marriages were less about land and more about consolidating economic influence. For peasant girls, childhood and adolescence were shaped almost entirely by labor. Life in rural villages required every family member to contribute to survival. Girls fetched water, gathered wood, tended gardens, fed livestock, spun thread, and helped cook for large families. Their education came from observation and participation. They often had little access to reading or writing, unless a local priest took interest or the family lived near a monastery. Marriage for peasant girls was practical. It meant gaining a partner to help with the land and starting a family that could contribute to the labor force. These marriages were usually arranged by parents, though with more room for personal preference than among noble. Girls were married young, often by 15 or 16, and bore children soon after. Their lives were hard but tightly woven into the community fabric. Urban life offered a unique set of conditions. Girls raised in cities like Paris, London, Florence, or Prague experienced faster social mobility and greater exposure to trade, culture, and ideas. Cities hosted craft guilds, which sometimes allowed women to train and work, especially as widows. Girls might serve as apprentices in clothing or food production. They were also more likely to come into contact with new religious movements, teachers, and patrons. Some girls joined Beguine communities, lay religious sisterhoods where women lived communally and devoted themselves to charity without taking permanent vows. These spaces gave girls and women a degree of independence rarely found elsewhere in society. The religious path offered one of the few true alternatives to marriage. Convents across Europe provided not only spiritual refuge but also education, structure, and in some cases influence. Noble families sometimes placed daughters in convents to avoid less favorable marriages, consolidate inheritance, or as acts of piety. For the girls themselves, this could be a sanctuary or a prison, depending on the circumstance. Within convent walls, girls were taught to read, copy texts, illuminate manuscripts, and lead structured lives of prayer and labor. Some became abbesses, powerful leaders who governed lands, advised nobles, and managed substantial wealth. Others lived in silence, obedience, and seclusion. Convents were not a utopia, but they could offer safety, education, and purpose beyond wifehood. Marriage customs also varied by region. In southern Europe, especially in Spain and southern Italy, family honor and female chastity were rigorously guarded. Girls were married young, often to older men, and kept under close watch. Dowries were large and carefully negotiated. Girls might be confined to the home before marriage, and discouraged from appearing in public without a male escort. In these societies, a family's reputation rested heavily on the conduct of its daughters. Stories of dishonor could travel quickly, and punishment for real or perceived transgressions was often severe. In contrast, parts of Northern Europe offered slightly more freedom. In the Low Countries and some parts of England and Germany, the rise of town economies created new roles for women. Girls could participate in informal education, work in family shops, or take on roles in local guilds. Marriage still marked the central transition in their lives, but there was slightly more room for interaction between unmarried girls and the public world. In these regions, the influence of local custom often moderated church teachings, resulting in more nuanced expectations for courtship, dowries, and gender roles. Climate and geography played subtle but important roles. In colder regions, girls spent more time indoors, focused on spinning, sewing, and food preservation. In warmer climates, agriculture was year-round, and girls worked longer days in the field. Mountainous regions required physical endurance and community cooperation, and girls were sometimes valued for their strength as much as their modesty. Coastal regions exposed girls to trade, migration, and stories from abroad. These girls might see foreign fabrics, hear foreign tongues, and imagine lives very different from their own, even if they had little chance of ever living them. The concept of family structure also varied. In extended households, girls might live with grandparents, aunts, or older cousins. These multi-generational homes offered support networks, but also layers of authority. In nuclear families, girls experienced more direct control from parents, but occasionally more emotional closeness. Orphaned girls faced a different fate entirely. They might be taken in by relatives, placed in church-run homes, or forced into servitude. Some became domestic workers by the age of 10 or 11, hired by other households for labor in exchange for food, clothing, or a dowry fund. Their futures depended entirely on the charity or cruelty of others. Legal systems across Europe also reflected regional distinctions. In some towns, girls could inherit land or manage property, especially if no brothers were present. In others, inheritance was strictly patrilineal, and girls were compensated only through dowries. Local courts sometimes handled disputes over betrothals, dowries, or accusations of dishonor. While the church maintained authority over the sacrament of marriage, local lords and councils controlled much of the social and legal infrastructure. Girls growing up in feudal territories often had fewer protections than those living under urban charters, or in merchant republics. Language and literacy shaped the contours of a girl's world. In Latin-speaking regions, most religious texts were inaccessible to the average girl, unless she lived in a convent. But in areas with growing vernacular literature, like England, France, and parts of Germany, girls occasionally heard stories or songs in their native tongues. These tales, often shared orally, included local legends, saintly miracles, moral warnings, and romantic ballads. Some girls sang songs while working, learned prayers from elders, and carried cultural memory through voice, not text. Among all these variations, the universals still held weight. Girls were expected to marry, they were expected to be obedient, chaste, and industrious. Their primary value was reproductive and domestic. Their legal rights were limited, their education partial, their freedoms conditional. But even within these constraints, girls found moments of agency. A merchant's daughter managing the accounts, a peasant girl choosing between two local suitors, a noblewoman leveraging marriage to protect her family's land, a nun who wrote letters that reached bishops and kings. These stories do not cancel the hardships, but they complicate the narrative in necessary ways. Cultural beliefs also shaped expectation. In some regions, girls were told that suffering brought spiritual reward. In others, they were warned that beauty invited sin. Some cultures emphasized silence and obedience, others valued singing, storytelling and ritual. These differences mattered, not just in behavior, but in how girls saw themselves. A girl raised to believe that pain made her holy might accept suffering more quietly than a girl told that prayer and kindness would bring earthly blessing. Religious instruction was often tailored to local beliefs, shaped by local clergy, and reinforced by folk customs that stretched back generations. Girls were also shaped by war, plague and famine. In times of crisis, marriages were delayed, children abandoned, or girls married off early to secure protection. In plague years, whole communities disappeared. Girls orphaned by disease were vulnerable to exploitation, trafficking or early death. During famines, dowries dried up, and girls were sometimes sent into labor or forced marriages just to survive. War displaced families, destroyed farms, and shattered social contracts. Yet even in such upheaval, the grooming of girls for wifehood rarely stopped, it simply adapted. Some girls, of course, defied their roles. They disguised themselves as boys to escape arranged marriages. They ran away with lovers, or joined pilgrimages alone. They entered heretical movements, or challenged male authority. These girls are hard to find in the historical record, but they existed. Their stories whisper from the edges of chronicles, from the margins of court records, and from the silences of letters never sent. They remind us that not all lives fit the mold. As we close this series, it's worth remembering that the phrase "a girl's life in medieval Europe" hides infinite variation. There was no single Europe, no single girl, no single path. There was only the body she was born into, the soil beneath her feet, and the expectations that greeted her each morning. Some girls walked those paths quietly, others resisted, in ways small or big. All of them lived within systems older than memory, and yet they carried with them something more enduring, the quiet strength to live, to endure, and sometimes to imagine something different. Section Conclusion. Reflection, recap, engagement. Throughout this series, we've walked alongside the silent, overlooked, and deeply constrained journey of the medieval girl. From the earliest cries of infancy, to the echoes of wedding bells and whispered vows, every chapter of her life was shaped, not by personal ambition or freedom of choice, but by systems older than she could comprehend. Her days were filled with the expectations of others, her family, her church, her society. She was trained, molded, and positioned from cradle to marriage for a role that had been waiting for her long before she was even born. In Chapter 1, we explored early childhood, the moment of birth, baptism, and the first impressions of obedience. We saw how little girls, sometimes just barely beyond infancy, were initiated into lives of labor and quiet instruction. Toys weren't just for play, they were miniature tools for future domesticity. Stories weren't about adventure, they were about virtue and punishment. Even laughter had to be measured. Peasant girls worked, noble girls watched and learned. All girls absorbed lessons in silence, self-denial, and modesty. In that foundational stage, they were not just being raised, they were being shaped. Then, in Chapter 2, we entered the grooming years. These were the formative seasons when girlhood became rehearsal for womanhood. A girl was no longer a child, yet not yet a wife. She was in between, but even in that in-between, every expectation was sharp and clear. She was taught to clean, to sew, to serve, and to obey. In noble homes, this meant mastering courtly manners and religious devotion. In rural homes, it meant learning the weight of a full bucket and the rhythm of the harvest. Her body was watched, her behavior was corrected, her soul was judged. This stage of life was not about who she was becoming for herself, but who she needed to be for others. In Chapter 3, we crossed into puberty and marriage preparations. Suddenly, a girl's body became public interest. Menstruation was not just a physical milestone, it was a societal alert. She was now of marriageable age, her family moved swift. A betrothal might already be in place, or discussions would begin with urgency. Virginity became currency. Her emotions were silenced. Her consent, though technically required by the church, was often overlooked or assumed. Dowries were calculated, alliances were forged. Her future husband may have been a stranger, but her path toward him was now a march, not a meander. Chapter 4 brought us to the wedding itself, and everything that followed. For the girl, the wedding was a threshold. It was the official, public moment where she left her old name, her old home, and in many ways, her old self behind. She entered a new household, not as a guest, but as property. Her husband had rights over her labor, her time, her fertility, and her body. The church sanctified it, the community celebrated it, and the girl, now a wife, began her new life under the weight of expectations that she had been trained for but never chose. And in chapter 5 we pulled back to look at the broader map, the many variations in a girl's life, depending on class, geography, family structure, and local custom. We saw that noble girls bore the burden of political marriages, merchant girls carried the responsibility of trade, and peasant girls carried buckets, baskets, and babies. Some girls lived in cities, surrounded by guilds and markets. Others worked the land their entire life. A few entered convents, claiming a different kind of womanhood, still controlled but slightly more self-directed, and a rare few rebelled, escaping, resisting, writing, or simply surviving outside the mold. Taken together, these chapters form a picture not of a single girl, but of millions, each with a different face, but nearly all shaped by the same forces. Family, church, and society did not merely guide a girl's life, they scripted it. And yet, within that script, every girl lived a real beating, thinking, feeling life. She had fears, she had dreams, she had moments of joy that no history book could fully capture. To be a girl in medieval Europe was to be watched more than listened to. It was to be measured more than known. Her value was determined before she had the language to describe herself. Her choices were narrowed before she understood what freedom might mean. And yet, she endured. She carried life forward, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, even when she had no voice in how her own was lived. What surprises many today is just how early these expectations were enforced. Childhood was brief, play was regulated, education was narrow and moralistic. A girl who questioned, resisted, or even hesitated too long might find herself punished, or worse, dismissed as unnatural. But this system wasn't maintained by cruelty alone. It was reinforced through love, tradition, faith, and necessity. Mothers passed it to daughters, not because they wanted to oppress them, but because they had once been shaped by the same rules and had learned to survive within them. We must also remember the labor. Girls were not idle. From morning to night they worked. They spun, cooked, cleaned, harvested, fetched, scrubbed, stitched and soothed. Their hands were always busy, their eyes always alert. In castles they carried trays and stitched tapestry. In villages, they turned soil and carried firewood. Their labor sustained homes, families, and entire economies. And yet their names are rarely preserved. Their hands touched everything, but left few marks in the record. Some of the most haunting details are found in the margins of historical texts. References to unnamed girls who died in childbirth, who were betrothed at 7, or who ran away and were never seen again. These fragments remind us that for all the structure and ceremony, real people lived through these systems. Some girls embraced their roles, others broke under them, most simply did what was expected, because they had no other option. That's not weakness, that's survival. In reflecting on this history, we must resist the temptation to romanticize or judge. Medieval girlhood was neither a fairy tale, nor a horror story. It was a complex human experience shaped by its time. What it asks of us today is not outrage or pity, but understand. These girls lived without the freedoms many of us now take for granted, but they lived fully, with love, pain, effort, endurance, and often quiet brilliance. And their stories didn't end with marriage. Some went on to raise many children, some buried most of them, some became widows at 20, some lived into old age, advising daughters and granddaughters on how to survive the same systems. A few became saints, a few became legends, most became forgotten, but they made history possible. Why does this story matter now? Because the history of girls, of their labor, their silence, their shaping, is the foundation of everything else. We often speak of kings, battles, and revolution, but behind every one of those events were women who cooked the meals, bore the children, patched the wounds, and kept the fires burning. These women, and the girls they once were, held up the world. And for every girl whose name we'll never know, there's a legacy that continues. In every grandmother's recipe, every family story, every small resistance handed down, something of those medieval girls survives. They are part of our shared past, not just as symbols, but as real people who lived and struggled and mattered. We invite you now to reflect. Which part of a medieval girl's life surprised you most? Was it how early marriage began, the strictness of gender roles, the lack of education, or was it the quiet strength required to endure it all? Leave a comment. Let's bring their voices back into the conversation. Let's explore how the lives of girls, so often overlooked in grand narratives, shaped entire cultures from the ground up. And if this series moved you, educated you, or made you curious, we invite you to keep learning. Check out our other episodes, A Boy's Life in Medieval Europe, where we explore how expectations of masculinity shaped youth and identity, or dive deeper into medieval marriage customs explained, where we unpack how ritual law and symbolism governed the union of two lives in the Middle Ages. If you found value in this series, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell more stories that deserve to be heard. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a girl's life from childhood to wifehood in medieval Europe. Over the course of this series, we've explored a world that often goes unnoticed in textbooks, a world where childhood wasn't innocent, where expectations were heavy, and where a girl's future was written long before she could shape it herself. From birth to betrothal, from quiet kitchens to public altars, we've seen how her life was defined by the systems around her: family, church, class, and custom. These weren't fairy tales. This was reality for millions of girls across centuries. And while no two lives were exactly the same, there was a pattern, a structure that turned daughters into wives with astonishing speed and little choice. Yet within that structure, there was still thought, feeling, resilience, and complexity. These girls lived real human lives, even if history often failed to record them. This story matters because it asks us to remember the forgotten, to consider the silent roles that built the foundations of families, economies, and entire culture. The kings, knights, and crusaders may fill the headlines of medieval history, but behind them stood generations of girls, working, enduring, serving, and surviving. If this series made you pause, if it helped you see the past from a new perspective, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below, and let us know what part of a medieval girl's life surprised you most. Was it the age of marriage, the lack of education, the burden of obedience, or the strength it must have taken just to keep going? We believe that history doesn't belong only to the loudest voice. It belongs to everyone, to the overlooked, the ordinary, and the forgotten. And that's why Sleepless Boring History exists, to tell the stories that history books often skip, and to bring quiet lives back into the light. If you haven't already, hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us grow and keeps these kinds of stories coming. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden corners of the medieval world, check out our other episodes, like A Boy's Life in Medieval Europe, where we explore how young boys were trained for labor, war, and duty, or Medieval Marriage Customs Explained, where we unpack the strange rituals and legal meanings behind the wedding vows of the time. Thanks again for being part of this journey. We hope it sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and left you with a deeper appreciation for the lives lived in silence. Until next time, keep wondering, keep learning, and stay sleepless. This is Sleepless Boring History. See you in the next one.